For 20 years, the Rossi and O'Brien families had been at war in San Francisco's North Beach. Their restaurants sat side by side on the same street, but they hated each other with a passion that had poisoned an entire neighborhood. Customers had to choose sides. Children crossed the street to avoid the other family. Even the mailman delivered letters with fear in his heart. But tonight, everything was about to explode. Marco Rossi, 19 years old, and Patrick O'Brien, 18, had just discovered they were both in love with the same girl. Elena Martinez, the most beautiful girl in North Beach, had no idea she was about to become the spark that would either destroy two families forever or give them the chance to heal 20 years of hatred. What nobody knew was that Bruce Lee had been watching this war unfold from his martial arts studio window. And when he saw those two boys buy flowers for the same girl, he realized this was his moment to end a feud that had gone on far too long. It was a warm Tuesday evening in August 1973, and Columbus Avenue was buzzing with its usual dinner crowd. But if you looked carefully, you could see the invisible line that divided North Beach right down the middle. On the east side of the street stood Rossi's Italian kitchen, with its red checkered tablecloths and the smell of garlic and basil wafting through open windows. On the west side sat O'Brien's Irish pub, where the sound of fiddle music mixed with laughter and the clink of beer glasses. Between these two establishments ran a river of hatred so deep that it had shaped the entire character of the neighborhood for 2 decades. Antonio Rossi was 52 years old, a proud man who had immigrated from Sicily in 1951, with nothing but a recipe for marinara sauce and an unshakable belief that hard work could build anything. He had spent 23 years creating his restaurant, perfecting every dish, building relationships with suppliers, earning the loyalty of customers who came not just for the food, but for the sense of family that Antonio had cultivated in every corner of his establishment. Across the street, Sean O'Brien was 55, an Irishman who had arrived in America in 1948, fleeing the economic devastation of post-war Ireland. He had worked construction jobs for 5 years, saving every penny until he could open his pub, a place where Irish immigrants could find familiar music, familiar faces, and the kind of warm welcome that reminded them of home. For the first few years of their businesses, Antonio and Sean had been friendly competitors. They had exchanged pleasantries when they saw each other on the street, had even referred customers to each other when one establishment was full. North Beach was big enough for both of them, and their offerings were different enough that they served complementary rather than competing needs. But then came 1953, and the incident that would poison 20 years of what should have been friendship. Antonio's restaurant had been struggling through a particularly harsh winter. A kitchen fire had destroyed much of his equipment, and he was facing the possibility of losing everything he had built. In desperation, he had approached Sean O'Brien, not as a competitor, but as a fellow immigrant who understood what it meant to risk everything for a dream. Sean, Antonio had said, standing in the pub on a cold February evening, his pride swallowed by necessity. "I need to ask for your help. The fire, it took almost everything. I need $2,000 to buy new equipment, to keep my doors open. I can pay you back within 6 months, with interest. I give you my word." Sean had looked at Antonio, this proud Italian man who was swallowing his dignity to ask for help, and had seen something of himself in the desperation behind those eyes. Without hesitation, Sean had agreed. He had withdrawn $2,000 from his own savings, money he had been setting aside for improvements to his pub, and had handed it to Antonio with a simple handshake. "We immigrants have to stick together," Sean had said. "Pay me back when you can." The loan had saved Antonio's restaurant. Within 4 months, business was booming again. Antonio was earning more money than he had ever seen, and he had the means to repay Sean immediately. But as the 6th month approached, Antonio found himself facing a crisis of pride rather than finance. The problem wasn't that he couldn't pay back the loan. The problem was that he had never properly thanked Sean for saving his business. In his Sicilian upbringing, accepting help was a sign of weakness, and acknowledging debt was an admission of failure. Instead of expressing gratitude, Antonio had convinced himself that Sean's loan was simply good business, one restaurant owner helping another for mutual benefit. When Antonio finally appeared at O'Brien's pub in August 1953 to repay the loan, he did so with the cold formality of a business transaction. He placed $2,200 on the bar, nodded curtly at Sean, and said simply, "We're even now." No thank you. No acknowledgement of how Sean's generosity had saved not just a business, but a man's entire future in America. Just the repayment of money, as if the previous 6 months of struggle and salvation had been nothing more than a financial arrangement. Sean had stared at the money, then at Antonio's retreating figure, and had felt something break inside his chest. It wasn't about the money, it had never been about the money. It was about respect, about recognition, about the simple human courtesy of acknowledging when someone has extended themselves to help you survive. "That's it?" Sean had called out as Antonio reached the door. "That's all you have to say?" Antonio had paused, his hand on the door handle, his back still turned to Sean. "The debt is paid," he had replied without turning around. What else is there to say? What else, indeed? In that moment, Sean O'Brien understood that he had misjudged Antonio Rossi completely. This wasn't a fellow immigrant who understood the value of mutual support. This was a man who took kindness for granted, who accepted help as his due rather than as a gift. "Get out," Sean had said quietly, his Irish accent thickening with anger. "And don't come back." Antonio had left without another word, and from that day forward, the two men had never spoken again. But silence wasn't enough to contain the hurt and anger that festered between them. Within months, the Cold War had begun. Antonio would sweep his sidewalk and deliberately push the dust toward O'Brien's entrance. Sean would position his loudest musicians near the windows facing the Italian restaurant, timing their performances to coincide with Antonio's dinner rush. Customers began to notice the tension, and human nature being what it is, began to take sides. Some were drawn to the drama, choosing their restaurant based on their allegiance in the ongoing feud. Others were simply uncomfortable with the obvious hostility, and stopped coming to North Beach altogether, finding their entertainment in neighborhoods where they could enjoy a meal without feeling like they were walking through a war zone. The feud escalated slowly but surely. When Antonio painted his restaurant's exterior a cheerful yellow, Sean painted his pub a bold green, the colors clashing deliberately across the narrow street. When Sean installed new lighting that illuminated his outdoor seating area, Antonio responded with even brighter lights that cast shadows across Sean's tables. But the real victims of this war were the children. Marco Rossi had been born in 1954, just a year after the feud began. He had grown up knowing that the O'Brien family was the enemy, though he was never given a clear explanation of why. All he knew was that he was forbidden to speak to anyone with the O'Brien name, forbidden to eat at their pub, forbidden even to look directly at their building when he passed by on the street. Patrick O'Brien, born in 1955, had received the same education and hatred from his side of the divide. To Patrick, the Rossi family represented everything that was wrong with entitled immigrants who took help for granted and gave nothing back to their community. For 18 years, these two boys had lived 3 blocks apart, had attended the same schools, had walked the same streets, had probably passed within feet of each other hundreds of times, and had never spoken a single word to each other. They were strangers separated not by geography or genuine differences, but by their father's wounded pride and stubborn refusal to communicate. But now in August 1973, something was about to happen that would change everything. Elena Martinez was 17 years old, the daughter of Carlos Martinez, who ran the small grocery store at the corner of Columbus and Green Street. Elena was beautiful in the way that transcends simple physical attractiveness. She had the kind of inner light that made everyone who met her feel like they were in the presence of something special. Elena had grown up watching the Rossi-O'Brien feud with the clear eyes of someone who wasn't invested in either side's version of the truth. To her, the whole thing seemed tragically stupid, Two successful men destroying their own happiness and poisoning their neighborhood over something that had happened before she was even born. But Elena had never said anything about her feelings regarding the feud, because she had never been asked. The adults in North Beach had become so accustomed to the division that they barely noticed it anymore. It was simply part of the landscape, like the hills or the bay or the fog that rolled in every evening. What the adults didn't notice, however, was that both Marco Rossi and Patrick O'Brien had been watching Elena Martinez with the intense fascination of young men discovering what it means to fall in love. Marco had first noticed Elena 6 months earlier when he had been walking home from his job at the fishing docks. She had been sitting on the steps of her father's store, reading a book and unconsciously tucking a strand of dark hair behind her ear. The simple grace of that gesture had stopped Marco in his tracks, and he had stood there on the sidewalk for 5 minutes, just watching her read, until she had looked up and smiled at him. That smile had changed everything for Marco. Suddenly, his walks home from work took a detour past the Martinez grocery store. He began timing his errands to coincide with Elena's presence in the neighborhood. He started helping elderly customers carry their groceries, not out of simple kindness, but because it gave him an excuse to linger near Elena's father's store. Meanwhile, Patrick O'Brien had been falling in love with Elena in his own way. As a member of the school's music program, Patrick often practiced his guitar in Washington Square Park, just a block from the Martinez store. He had noticed Elena walking through the park on her way home from school, and had begun timing his practice sessions to coincide with her daily routine. For 3 months, Patrick had been playing his guitar in the park every afternoon, hoping Elena would stop to listen. When she finally did, approaching his bench one Tuesday afternoon, and asking if he knew any Spanish folk songs, Patrick had felt like his heart might burst from happiness. Neither boy knew about the other's attention to Elena. Marco thought he was Elena's only admirer. Patrick was certain he was her only suitor. And Elena, sweet and kind as she was, had no idea that her friendly smiles and polite conversations were being interpreted as signs of romantic interest by two boys whose families would rather see them dead than see them happy. The crisis came to a head on Tuesday evening, August 14, 1973. Marco had finally worked up the courage to approach Elena directly. He had saved money from his dock job to buy her flowers, had practiced what he would say, had even written a letter expressing his feelings, a letter he planned to give her along with a bouquet of red roses. At exactly the same time, 3 blocks away, Patrick O'Brien was preparing his own romantic gesture. He had been saving money from his part-time job at a music store to buy Elena a small piece of jewelry, a delicate silver bracelet that he had seen her admiring in the window of Benedetti's jewelry shop. Both boys, unknown to each other, had decided that Tuesday evening would be the night they declared their love. Maria Santos had owned the flower shop on Columbus Avenue for 32 years, and she had never been as terrified as she was at 6:30 that Tuesday evening. 2 young men stood in her shop, both holding red roses, both asking for arrangements for the same girl. But these weren't just any 2 boys. This was Marco Rossi and Patrick O'Brien, sons of the 2 families whose hatred had defined North Beach for 20 years. Maria knew both boys by sight, had watched them grow up on opposite sides of the neighborhood's invisible war zone. She also knew that if either family discovered what was happening, if they learned that both boys were in love with the same girl, her flower shop would become ground zero for an explosion that had been building for 2 decades. "Please," Marco was saying, unaware that Patrick was standing just 10 feet behind him, examining a display of daisies. "I need the most beautiful arrangement you can make. Red roses, baby's breath, maybe some of those white flowers. I don't know their names, but they smell like heaven." Behind him, Patrick was having his own conversation with Maria's assistant. "The roses need to be perfect," Patrick was insisting. "This is the most important moment of my life. She has to know how much she means to me." Maria felt like she was watching a fuse burn down toward a powder keg. At any moment, the 2 boys would notice each other. At any moment, they would realize they were both there for the same purpose. And when that happened, "Marco," she said carefully, trying to keep her voice steady. Your father, does he know you're buying flowers for Elena Martinez? Marco looked puzzled. Why would I tell Papa? This is my business, not his. And Patrick, Maria continued, turning to the Irish boy. Does your father know about your feelings for this girl? Patrick frowned. I don't see what business it is of his. I'm 18 years old. I can buy flowers for whoever I want. That's when both boys looked at each other for the first time in their lives. Really looked at each other. Marco saw a tall, red-haired boy about his own age, holding a bouquet of roses identical to his own. Patrick saw a dark-haired Italian boy, well-dressed and obviously nervous, clutching flowers that were clearly intended for the same purpose as his own. For a moment, neither boy spoke. The flower shop fell completely silent, except for the ticking of Maria's old clock and the distant sound of traffic on Columbus Avenue. Then Patrick said slowly, "You're Marco Rossi." Marco nodded. "And you're Patrick O'Brien." Another silence. Then Marco asked the question that would change everything. "Those flowers, are they for Elena Martinez?" Patrick's grip tightened on his bouquet. "Are yours?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke. 20 years of family hatred, 18 years of enforced separation, and now this moment of recognition that they were both in love with the same girl. That's when Bruce Lee walked into the flower shop. Bruce Lee had not planned to buy flowers that evening. He had been walking home from his martial arts studio 3 blocks away, thinking about a conversation he had had with a student earlier that day about the nature of conflict and resolution. But when he saw the fear in Maria Santos' eyes through the flower shop window, when he witnessed the tension radiating from 2 young men who were clearly on the verge of either violence or revelation, he knew that fate had presented him with a teaching opportunity. "Good evening," Bruce Lee said calmly, nodding to Maria and then to both boys. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Marco and Patrick were both staring at Bruce Lee with the kind of starstruck fascination that comes from unexpectedly meeting someone famous. Bruce Lee's movies had made him a hero to young men throughout America, and his martial arts philosophy had gained respect even among people who had never seen him fight. "Mr. Lee," Marco managed to say, his conflict with Patrick momentarily forgotten. "We were just buying flowers." Bruce Lee smiled slightly, taking in the scene with eyes that missed nothing. 2 boys, same age, both nervous, both holding identical bouquets, both clearly in love and clearly rivals. He could read the entire situation in their posture, in the way they held themselves in relation to each other, in the careful distance they maintained despite the shop's small space. "Flowers for the same girl?" Bruce Lee asked gently. Both boys flushed red. Patrick opened his mouth to deny it, but found himself nodding instead. There was something about Bruce Lee's presence that made lying feel impossible. "Elena Martinez," Marco admitted. Bruce Lee nodded thoughtfully. "And you are Marco Rossi," Marco said, then gestured toward Patrick. "And this is Patrick O'Brien." If Bruce Lee was surprised to discover that he had wandered into the middle of the North Beach feud, he didn't show it. Instead, he looked from one boy to the other, with the kind of calm attention that made each of them feel like he was seeing not just their faces but their hearts. "I see," Bruce Lee said. "And how do you two plan to resolve this situation?" Marco looked confused. "Resolve it? You both love the same girl," Bruce Lee said simply. "You both want to give her flowers, you both hope to win her heart. But there is only one Elena, so the question becomes, what will you do about it?" Patrick straightened up, and for a moment, 20 years of family hatred flickered in his eyes. "We'll let Elena decide," he said, his voice carrying a challenge. "May the best man win." Marco nodded, accepting the challenge. "Fine by me. Elena is smart enough to know quality when she sees it." Bruce Lee watched this exchange with interest, noting how quickly both boys had fallen into the competitive pattern their families had taught them. Fight first, understand later. Win at all costs, regardless of what victory might cost everyone else. Interesting approach, Bruce Lee said. But may I ask you both a question first? Both boys nodded. What do you know about Elena? What makes her happy? What are her dreams, her fears, her hopes for the future? Marco opened his mouth to answer, then closed it. He realized he had no idea what Elena wanted from life, what made her laugh, what kept her awake at night worrying. He knew she was beautiful, knew she was kind, knew she made him feel like the world was full of possibilities. But what did he actually know about her as a person? Patrick was having the same realization. He had fallen in love with Elena's smile, with the way she listened to his guitar playing, with the gentle way she spoke to her father's customers. But did he know anything about her inner life, her ambitions, her character beyond surface kindness? Marco started, then stopped. We haven't really talked much, Patrick admitted. Bruce Lee nodded. So you both want to win the heart of a girl you don't actually know. You're competing for a prize without understanding what that prize values, what she needs, what would actually make her happy. The truth of this statement hit both boys like a physical blow. They had been so focused on their own feelings, their own desires, their own need to be chosen, that they had never considered what Elena might want or need from a relationship. But more than that, Bruce Lee continued. You're approaching this as enemies instead of as two people who have something important in common. What could we possibly have in common? Marco asked, the family conditioning kicking in. Bruce Lee smiled. You both have excellent taste in women. Despite themselves, both boys almost smiled. You both work hard to earn money for these flowers. Bruce Lee continued. You both have the courage to risk rejection by declaring your feelings. You both care enough about Elena to want to give her something beautiful. And you both are standing here at this moment because you believe love is worth fighting for. He paused, letting this sink in. The question is, are you fighting for Elena's happiness, or for your own ego? Marco and Patrick looked at each other, really looked at each other, for the second time in their lives. But this time, instead of seeing an enemy, each boy saw something else. Another young man in love, another person vulnerable and hopeful and terrified of rejection. What are you suggesting? Patrick asked Bruce Lee. I'm suggesting that maybe the best way to win Elena's heart isn't to compete with each other. Bruce Lee said, maybe it's to show her something she's never seen before in North Beach. Two people choosing cooperation over conflict. You mean work together? Marco asked. I mean get to know her. Bruce Lee said, find out what she actually wants. Learn about her dreams, her interests, her hopes for the future. And then, instead of trying to defeat each other, try to help each other become the kind of men she would actually want to be with. This was such a radical concept that both boys fell silent, processing it. But what if she chooses him? Marco asked, nodding toward Patrick. Then you'll know she's chosen someone who helped you become a better person, Bruce Lee replied. And what if she chooses you? He asked Patrick. Patrick thought about this. Then I'll know she chose someone I helped become worthy of her. And what if, Bruce Lee said with a slight smile, she chooses neither of you, but because you've learned to work together instead of fighting, you've both become better men, and gained a friendship that will last the rest of your lives. The flower shop fell quiet again, but this time the silence felt different. Instead of tension and impending conflict, there was a sense of possibility, of paths opening instead of closing. How do we start? Marco asked. Bruce Lee looked at both boys, then at the identical bouquets in their hands. You start by buying one arrangement together. You both contribute to it, you both sign the card, and you both give it to Elena with an invitation. What kind of invitation? Patrick asked. Invite her to teach you who she really is, Bruce Lee said. Tell her you both admire her, that you both would like to know her better, and that you both believe she deserves better than to be fought over like a prize. Ask her what she would like. Friendship, courtship, or simply to be left alone to make her own choices without pressure from either of you. It was a revolutionary idea, asking Elena what she wanted instead of assuming they knew. Maria Santos, who had been listening to this entire conversation with growing amazement, stepped forward. "I can make one beautiful arrangement," she said quietly, "with flowers from both of your bouquets. It will be the most beautiful arrangement Elena has ever received, because it will represent something that has never existed in North Beach: cooperation between the Rossi and O'Brien families." And so, under Bruce Lee's gentle guidance and Maria Santos' expert hands, Marco Rossi and Patrick O'Brien created their first collaboration, a stunning arrangement of red roses, white lilies, and baby's breath, with a card signed by both boys. "For Elena, with admiration and respect. We would like to know you better, if you would like to know us. Your friends Marco and Patrick." But Bruce Lee wasn't finished with his lesson. "Before you give this to Elena," he said, "there's something else you need to do." "What's that?" both boys asked. "You need to tell your fathers what you're doing." The color drained from both boys' faces. "Mr. Lee," Marco said, "you don't understand. If my father finds out I'm working with Patrick, if my dad learns I'm cooperating with a Rossi," Patrick added, "then they'll learn something they should have learned 20 years ago," Bruce Lee said firmly. "That their children are wiser than they are, and that love is stronger than hate." Bruce Lee walked with both boys as they carried the shared flower arrangement toward Elena's house. Along the way, he told them the story he had pieced together from 20 years of observation, neighborhood gossip, and his own understanding of human nature. "Your fathers weren't always enemies," Bruce Lee said. 20 years ago, they were both immigrants trying to build new lives in a strange country. They had more in common than they had differences. But pride, stubborn, stupid pride, turned gratitude into resentment, turned friendship into war. "But what really happened?" Marco asked. Bruce Lee told them about the loan, about the fire, about the way a simple lack of communication had poisoned 2 decades of what should have been mutual respect and community support. "So they've been fighting over nothing?" Patrick asked, incredulous. "They've been fighting over everything," Bruce Lee corrected. "Over respect, over recognition, over the simple human need to be acknowledged and appreciated. The money was never the real issue. The real issue was that 2 proud men forgot how to say thank you and I'm sorry." By the time they reached Elena's house, both boys understood that they were carrying more than flowers. They were carrying the possibility of healing not just their own relationship, but their family's 20-year wound. Elena Martinez opened her door to find 2 boys she recognized, standing together, something she had never seen in her entire life, holding the most beautiful flower arrangement she had ever received. "Marco, Patrick," Elena said, clearly surprised. "What? How? Why are you 2 together?" "We wanted to ask you something," Marco said, his voice nervous but determined. "We both like you," Patrick added, his face red but his voice steady. "But we realized we don't actually know you very well." Elena looked from one boy to the other, then at the flowers, then back at their faces. She was trying to process not just what they were saying, but the impossible fact that they were saying it together. "We want to know what you want," Marco continued. "Not what we want, but what would make you happy." "We thought maybe," Patrick's voice trailed off, and he looked at Marco for support. "We thought maybe we could all be friends," Marco finished. "Real friends who actually know each other." Elena stared at them for a long moment, and then did something neither boy expected. She started crying. Not sad tears, but the kind of tears that come when someone gives you something you didn't even know you wanted. For 17 years Elena had watched the adults in North Beach teach their children to hate each other. She had seen friends separated by family feuds, had watched potential relationships destroyed by inherited prejudices. And now, here were 2 boys offering her something no one had ever offered before, a choice that didn't require her to take sides, that didn't force her to participate in someone else's war. "Yes," Elena said, wiping her eyes and accepting the flowers. "I would like that very much. I would like to be friends with both of you." But Elena had an idea that would change everything even more dramatically. "There's going to be a North Beach festival next month," she said. Both your families are planning booths, planning to compete against each other like they do every year. What if we could change that? What do you mean? Marco asked. What if instead of competing they worked together? Elena suggested. What if the Rossi and O'Brien families created one booth together? Italian-Irish fusion food, Italian songs and Irish music played together. A celebration of what makes both cultures beautiful instead of a fight over which one is better. The idea was so bold, so completely opposite to everything North Beach had been for 20 years, that both boys fell silent. Elena, Patrick said slowly. Our fathers would never agree to that. They might, Elena said, if they saw their sons working together first, if they saw that cooperation was possible, that it made their children happier instead of making them enemies. Elena's plan was brilliant in its simplicity. Instead of asking the fathers to make peace directly, which their pride would never allow, she was suggesting that the sons demonstrate the benefits of cooperation. Let the results speak for themselves. But how do we start? Marco asked. Elena smiled. We start with food. Marco, you know your father's recipes. Patrick, you know your father's. What if we created some dishes that combined both traditions? What if we showed North Beach that Italian and Irish flavors could complement each other instead of competing? And so began the most unusual courtship in North Beach history. 3 young people working together to heal a community, using food as their bridge between cultures. Over the next 3 weeks, Elena, Marco and Patrick met every afternoon in the Martinez family's kitchen. Elena's father, Carlos, had agreed to let them experiment with recipes, partly because he was curious about the results, but mostly because he had watched his daughter become happier than he had ever seen her. The cooking sessions were revelatory for all 3 young people. Marco discovered that Patrick was not the enemy he had been taught to see, but a thoughtful, creative person with a deep love of music and a gentle sense of humor. Patrick found that Marco was not an arrogant Italian, but a hard-working young man who was passionate about food and fiercely loyal to the people he cared about. And Elena discovered that both boys were more interested in her thoughts, her ideas, and her dreams than in competing for her romantic attention. What do you want to do with your life? Patrick asked her one afternoon as they were experimenting with a dish that combined Irish colcannon with Italian risotto. I want to be a teacher, Elena said without hesitation. I want to work with children, help them learn that differences don't have to mean divisions. I want them to grow up smarter than their parents about how to get along with people who seem different from them. Marco looked up from the stove where he was stirring their experimental fusion dish. That's beautiful, he said. You want to make sure the next generation doesn't inherit our mistakes. Exactly, Elena said. What about you two? What do you want to do? Marco had never really thought about his future beyond helping with his father's restaurant. But these afternoons with Elena and Patrick had opened his mind to new possibilities. I think I want to travel, Marco said slowly. I want to see how other people cook, how other families live, what other communities do when they have problems to solve. Maybe I could bring new ideas back to North Beach. Patrick nodded thoughtfully. I want to write music, he said. Songs that bring people together instead of keeping them apart. Music that celebrates what's beautiful about different cultures instead of fighting over which one is better. These conversations, happening over simmering pots and bubbling experiments, were teaching all 3 young people something their parents had forgotten, that getting to know someone as an individual makes it impossible to hate them as a category. But the real test would come when their fathers discovered what they were doing. The explosion came on a Thursday evening in early September. Antonio Rossi had been wondering why Marco was coming home late every day, why he smelled like unfamiliar spices, why he seemed happier and more energetic than usual. When Antonio decided to follow his son one afternoon, he discovered Marco entering the Martinez grocery store with Patrick O'Brien. At exactly the same moment, Sean O'Brien was making the same discovery from the opposite direction. He had been curious about Patrick's mysterious afternoon activities, and when he saw his son walking companionably with Marco Rossi toward the Martinez store, 20 years of carefully maintained hatred came roaring to the surface. Both men arrived at Carlos Martinez's store at the same time, both furious, both ready to end their children's inexplicable collaboration immediately and permanently. "Marco," Antonio bellowed as he burst through the store's front door. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" "Patrick," Sean shouted from behind him. "Get away from that boy this instant." The kitchen fell silent. Elena, Marco and Patrick stood frozen around a pot of what they had been calling peaceful pasta, a dish that combined Marco's family marinara sauce with Patrick's family's traditional Irish lamb stew, creating something entirely new and surprisingly delicious. "Papa," Marco said quietly. "I can explain." "There's nothing to explain," Antonio snapped. "You are forbidden to associate with this family. I don't care what you think you're doing, but it ends right now." Sean was equally furious. 20 years I've protected you from these people, and this is how you repay me. By sneaking around behind my back." Elena stepped forward, her voice calm but strong. "Mr. Rossi, Mr. O'Brien, please let them explain what they've been doing before you decide it's wrong." Both men turned to look at Elena, this 17-year-old girl who had somehow convinced their sons to betray 20 years of family loyalty. "You," Antonio said, pointing at Elena, "are the cause of this. You've turned my son against his own family." "She's done the opposite," Marco said, finding his voice. "Elena has helped me understand what family really means." "By consorting with our enemies," Sean demanded. "By learning that they were never really our enemies in the first place," Patrick said, stepping beside Marco. "Dad, do you even remember why you and Mr. Rossi stopped talking?" Sean's face reddened. "Of course I remember. Sean stopped, realizing that he had never actually told Patrick the full story of the feud's beginning. "Papa," Marco said gently, "tell me what happened 20 years ago. Tell me the real story." Antonio looked at his son, then at Sean, then at the pot of food that somehow smelled like home and adventure at the same time. "It's complicated," Antonio said finally. "No," Elena said firmly. "It's not." And then Elena Martinez did something that no adult in North Beach had dared to do for 20 years. She told both men the truth about their feud, as she had pieced it together from neighborhood gossip, her father's memories, and her own observations. "Mr. O'Brien, you loaned Mr. Rossi money when he needed it most. You saved his business, maybe his entire life in America. And Mr. Rossi, you paid the loan back exactly as you promised, with interest." Both men nodded, surprised that Elena knew these details. "But Mr. Rossi, you never said thank you. And Mr. O'Brien, instead of asking for gratitude, you decided to be angry about not receiving it. So you both let pride turn a successful business partnership into a 20-year war." Elena looked from one man to the other. "You've spent 20 years teaching your sons to hate each other over a misunderstanding that could have been resolved with 2 sentences. Thank you for saving my business, and you're welcome. I'm glad I could help." The kitchen fell completely silent. Antonio and Sean stared at Elena, then at each other, then at their sons who were standing together instead of apart. "It's too late now," Sean said quietly. "Too much has happened. Too much anger. Too much." "It's not too late," Marco interrupted. "Patrick and I have been working together for 3 weeks. Look what we created." He gestured to the kitchen around them, to the fusion dishes they had been experimenting with, to the friendship that had grown between 2 people who were supposed to be enemies. "Try this," Patrick said, ladling some of their experimental dish into 2 bowls and offering them to the fathers. "Try what happens when Irish and Italian traditions work together instead of fighting." Antonio and Sean looked at the bowls suspiciously, but the aroma was undeniably appealing. Slowly, reluctantly, each man took a taste. The silence that followed was different from any silence North Beach had experienced in 20 years. It was the silence of recognition, of surprise, of 2 proud men realizing that their children had created something beautiful from the very differences that had been used to justify hatred. "This is," Antonio started, then stopped. "This is really good," Sean finished, his voice filled with unwilling admiration. "It's better than good," Carlos Martinez said, from behind the counter, where he had been watching this entire drama unfold. "It's what North Beach could be if people stopped fighting long enough to see what they could build together." Elena stepped forward again, sensing that this was the crucial moment. Mr. Rossi, Mr. O'Brien, the North Beach Festival is next week. Both your families have booths planned, competing against each other like every year. What if this year was different? What if instead of fighting over customers, you gave them something they've never seen before? What are you suggesting? Antonio asked. A joint booth, Marco said, his voice gaining confidence. Rossi and O'Brien together, the best of Italian cooking and the best of Irish traditions, combined into something new and amazing. We've already worked out the logistics, Patrick added. We know which dishes would work together, how to organize the cooking, how to serve people efficiently. Sean looked at Antonio for the first time in 20 years, really looked at him, seeing not an enemy but a man who had aged the same way he had, who carried the same tiredness around his eyes, the same slight stoop from years of working in restaurant kitchens. Antonio, Sean said slowly, using his former friend's name for the first time since 1953. I need to say something I should have said 20 years ago. Antonio's face went pale. Sean, when you came to me for that loan, I saw myself in your situation. I remembered what it felt like to risk everything for a dream. Helping you wasn't charity, it was one immigrant helping another, because we both knew how hard it is to build something from nothing in a new country. Sean paused, gathering courage. When you paid me back without thanking me, I told myself it was because you were ungrateful, because you took my help for granted. But what I really think happened is that you were embarrassed about needing help, and I was too proud to tell you that I never expected gratitude for doing what any decent neighbor should do. Antonio stared at Sean, 20 years of defensive anger crumbling in his chest. Sean, Antonio said, his voice barely above a whisper. I was grateful, I was so grateful, I didn't know how to express it without admitting how desperate I had been, how close I came to losing everything. In Sicily, asking for help it's admitting weakness. But you saved my business. You saved my family's future in America. The words hung in the air between them like a bridge that had been 20 years in the building. I should have said thank you, Antonio continued. I should have said it every day for the rest of my life. Because of you, Marco grew up in a stable home instead of wondering where his next meal would come from. Sean felt tears prickling his eyes, and I should have told you that helping you made me feel good about myself, made me feel like I was contributing to something bigger than my own success. I should have told you that your success felt like my success too. Elena, Marco and Patrick watched this reconciliation with a mixture of joy and amazement. 20 years of hatred dissolved by 2 sentences. Thank you for saving my business, and you're welcome, I'm glad I could help. But Bruce Lee wasn't finished with his work in North Beach. As the 2 men shook hands for the first time in 2 decades, Bruce Lee appeared in the doorway of Carlos Martinez's store. He had been watching the neighborhood dynamics for weeks, waiting for the right moment to offer his final piece of wisdom. Gentlemen, Bruce Lee said, nodding to Antonio and Sean, I believe your sons have something to ask you. Marco and Patrick looked at each other, drawing strength from their newfound friendship. Papa, Mr. O'Brien, Marco said, we want your permission to create the joint festival booth. We want to show North Beach what's possible when families work together. Dad, Mr. Rossi, Patrick added. We want to prove that the next generation can be smarter than the previous one about solving problems. Bruce Lee stepped forward. What your sons are proposing isn't just about food or festivals, he said. It's about demonstrating that conflict resolution is possible, that pride doesn't have to be stronger than wisdom, that communities can heal when people choose cooperation over competition. He looked at both fathers with the kind of calm intensity that made his words feel like natural law. In martial arts, we learn that the strongest opponent is often the one inside your own mind, the voice that tells you that admitting error is weakness, that asking for help is failure, that saying I'm sorry means losing face. But true strength comes from overcoming that opponent, from choosing growth over ego. Antonio and Sean looked at their sons, then at each other, then at the evidence of what cooperation had already accomplished in just 3 weeks. If we do this joint booth, Sean said slowly. It can't be half-hearted. It has to be real partnership, real collaboration. Antonio nodded. Equal investment, equal work, equal sharing of profits and responsibility, and equal sharing of credit, Sean added. Rossi and O'Brien together, not one family helping the other. Agreed, Antonio said, extending his hand. This time, when the two men shook hands, it felt like the beginning of something rather than the end. The North Beach Festival that year became legendary throughout San Francisco. The Rossi O'Brien joint booth was unlike anything anyone had ever seen, not just because of the incredible fusion food they served, but because of what it represented. For the first time in 20 years, the two families worked side by side. Antonio and Sean discovered that they had both become excellent cooks, that they both cared deeply about serving their community, that they both took pride in creating something that brought people joy. Marco and Patrick found themselves becoming genuine friends, united not just by their shared interest in Elena, but by their shared vision of what North Beach could become. And Elena discovered that by refusing to choose between two suitors, she had gained something much more valuable: two friends who supported her dreams and respected her choices. The festival booth served hundreds of people over the weekend, but the real success wasn't measured in sales. It was measured in the conversations that happened, the connections that formed, the way neighbors began to see each other as individuals rather than as representatives of competing camps. Bruce Lee attended the festival as a customer, ordering food from the Rossi O'Brien booth and watching the transformation with quiet satisfaction. When Marco asked him how he had known that cooperation would work better than competition, Bruce Lee smiled. "I didn't know it would work," Bruce Lee admitted. "But I knew that hatred was definitely not working. After 20 years of division, trying something different was the only logical choice." "But how did you know we would listen to you?" Patrick asked. "Because you were both suffering," Bruce Lee replied. "You were both carrying anger that didn't belong to you, fighting a war you didn't start over reasons you didn't understand. People who are suffering are usually ready to try a different path if someone shows them where it leads." Elena, who had been listening to this conversation while serving customers, added her own insight. "Mr. Lee helped us see what we actually wanted," she said. "We thought we wanted to win against each other, but what we really wanted was to belong with each other." The success of the festival booth led to something even more remarkable. The two families decided to merge their restaurants. Not a takeover by one or absorption by the other, but a genuine partnership that combined the best of both traditions. Rossi O'Brien's, where two cultures create one family, became not just a restaurant, but a symbol of what was possible when people chose connection over conflict. The restaurant prospered, serving food that reflected the diversity of San Francisco, while honoring the traditions that each family brought from their homeland. Marco and Patrick both worked in the new restaurant, learning each other's family recipes and creating new dishes that represented their friendship. Elena went on to become a teacher, as she had planned, and she often brought her students to eat at Rossi O'Brien's as an example of how differences could be bridges rather than walls. But perhaps the most important change was in the neighborhood itself. The success of the Rossi O'Brien partnership inspired other families to reconsider their own prejudices and divisions. North Beach became known throughout San Francisco as a place where different cultures celebrated each other, rather than merely tolerating each other. Bruce Lee's role in this transformation was remembered and honored, but he never took credit for what the families had accomplished. When reporters asked him about his part in healing the 20-year feud, he would always redirect attention to the courage of the young people who had chosen cooperation over competition. "I merely asked a question," Bruce Lee would say. Marco, Patrick, and Elena provided the answers. Antonio and Sean had the wisdom to listen to their children. The real heroes of this story are the people who were willing to change. Years later, when Elena married, not Marco or Patrick, but a young teacher she met in college who shared her passion for education, both young men served as groomsmen at her wedding. By then they had become such close friends that people who didn't know the history assumed they were brothers. Marco eventually took over the cooking responsibilities at Rossi O'Brien's, developing a reputation as one of San Francisco's most innovative chefs. Patrick became a professional musician, writing songs about community and reconciliation that were performed at festivals throughout California. Antonio and Sean became genuine friends in their later years, spending hours together planning new menu items, sharing stories about their early days in America, and marveling at how much happiness they had missed during their 20 years of unnecessary hostility. The flower shop where this transformation had begun became a neighborhood landmark. Maria Santos kept a photograph on her wall showing Marco and Patrick creating their first joint flower arrangement, with Bruce Lee watching approvingly in the background. Under the photograph was a small plaque that read, "Where two enemies became friends, two families became one, and a community learned that love is stronger than hate." Bruce Lee's martial arts studio remained in North Beach for several more years, and he often told the story of Marco, Patrick, and Elena to his students as an example of how real strength comes from building bridges rather than walls. "Fighting is easy," Bruce Lee would teach. "Any fool can throw a punch, any coward can carry a grudge. But it takes real courage to say I'm sorry, real strength to say I forgive you, and real wisdom to say, let's try a different way." The lesson of North Beach spread far beyond the neighborhood's boundaries. The story was told in schools, written about in newspapers, and eventually became part of San Francisco's oral history. But for the people who lived through it, the most important lesson was the simplest one: that it's never too late to choose love over hate, cooperation over competition, understanding over prejudice. In the end, Bruce Lee's intervention in North Beach proved something that martial arts masters have always known: the most powerful technique isn't the one that defeats your opponent, but the one that transforms your enemy into your friend. And sometimes the most important battle isn't the one you fight, but the one you choose not to fight, because you've found a better way to solve the problem that made fighting seem necessary in the first place. The story of the Rossi-O'Brien feud became a North Beach legend, passed down from parents to children, as an example of what communities can accomplish when they choose healing over hatred. And every year during the North Beach Festival, people still gather at the booth that started it all, sharing food that represents not just the fusion of Italian and Irish traditions, but the possibility that any divide can be healed by people brave enough to reach across it. Today, if you walk down Columbus Avenue in North Beach, you can still see the restaurant that began as a symbol of division and became a testament to unity. The sign reads Rossi O'Brien's, where two cultures create one family, and inside the walls are covered with photographs that tell the story of how love conquered 20 years of hate. In one corner hangs the original flower arrangement that Marco and Patrick created together, preserved now, faded but still beautiful. A reminder that the most important victories are won not through conflict, but through the courage to try a different way. And sometimes, late in the evening when the restaurant is quiet, you can almost hear the echo of Bruce Lee's gentle voice asking the question that changed everything. What exactly are you fighting for? Because sometimes the most powerful question isn't how do I win, but what would happen if we all decided to win together.